All right. Good morning. Thank you so much for braving the cold to be here today. Welcome to the 14th annual University of Chicago International Education Conference, which is titled this year Beyond the Headlines, the Russia-Ukraine War in its global impacts. My name is Krishna Kulkarni, and I'm the outreach coordinator at the University of Chicago's Center for Middle Eastern Studies. I will be serving as your MC for the IEC conference today, and look forward to working with you. Thank you so much for participating in this important professional development activity. While I may be standing physically up here in front of you, I do not stand up here alone. This event was made possible by the hard work of many staff members here today. I'm just going to quickly go around and introduce them. Esther Peters from the Center for East European Russian Eurasian Studies and now the Sociology Department at UChicago. Connie Yip from the Center for East Asian Studies. Myra Sue from the Center for East Asian Studies. Matthew Weflin from the Center for East European Russian Eurasian Studies. Nay Grant from the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And I don't know where Haley is, but Haley from the Center for East Asian Studies. I would like to take a moment to point out, my dear colleagues, and remind you that we are all here to be resources for you, both during and after this conference. So should you have questions about learning more about a particular world region, please, or want to get involved in some of our outreach efforts, or sign up for our mailing lists, please let one of us know. We would like to also extend our thanks to additional program sponsors, the University of Chicago Neighborhood Schools Program and the Office of Civic Engagement. This conference is also made possible through generous support from Title VI National Resource Center grants from the U.S. Department of Education. Before we get started, I want to just go over a few housekeeping items. If you have not already done so, you can access today's program schedule, speaker bios, resource lists, and lesson plan by scanning the QR code available at the registration desk. This will lead you to our UChicago Educator Outreach website for the IEC. You can also type in educatoroutreach.uchicago.edu into your browser and navigate to the International Education Conference page from there. Wi-Fi access information is posted on the back windows, as well as there's a sign at the registration desk. Just a reminder, if you're on your phone right now, the network is UChicago-guest. The username is IEC, all caps, _, capital A, attendee. The password is global impacts with a capital G and a capital I. During today's programs, please silence your phones so that we can enjoy the program uninterrupted. If you do need to take a call or text message with sound, please step out momentarily. All sessions for the program will take place in this lecture hall. The only exception is lunch. So when you came in on the ground floor, unless you flew here. The lunchroom is located downstairs. Once we go for lunch, staff members are available to lead you down there. It's not hard to find, but we will come back up here after lunch for the resumption of the program. Bathroom locations. So there is a sign out there for men's and women's bathrooms just by the elevator. Additionally, if you'd like a single user restroom, you can take a left. If you walk straight out of this hall, take a left, go to the end of the hall, and then take a right. You kind of have to go through a little room, but there's a sign that says single user restroom that you can locate to. At the end of today, we will ask you to complete a survey. The survey link is on a QR code, also at the registration desk. Please take a couple moments to fill out the survey. It really helps us design professional development programs that are fit for your needs and your interests. Additionally, if any of you who are Illinois educators are interested in receiving CPDU credits for attending this event, please contact me. I'm going to be around at the conference. Just let me know. I'll take down your email and we'll save some trees by not printing the forms, and we can do it over email. Finally, please note that all the presentations, resources, links to videos are going to be posted on the educatoroutreach.uchicago.edu page after the conference. We will send an email out to follow up after the event to all your emails to notify you of this. Do we have any questions so far? No? Okay, fantastic. All right. Over the course of this day, we hope to explore the topic of the Russia-Ukraine war and gain a better understanding of its domestic and global impacts. We have a group of distinguished speakers who will approach the subject from a variety of perspectives, from government affairs, foreign policy and security considerations, agriculture, energy, and refugee concerns, to actual voices from Ukraine and classroom perspectives. We want to inspire connections for today and tomorrow, whether it be professional and interpersonal connections, materials and resources to consider connecting in your classroom, curricula, or institution, or bringing these complex issues a bit closer to home. We hope you will come away with some inspirations for you and your students, and that you will leave with experiences to bring back to share with your colleagues and schools. So let's just dive right into our program now. You've heard me talk enough. We begin today with a keynote lecture from Sherry Kennison Hall, who is a public diplomacy officer in the Bureau of Europe and Eurasian Affairs of the U.S. State Department. Ms. Kennison Hall is a career public diplomacy officer. She previously served in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs as the branch chief for European and Eurasian Fulbright programs. She has also served as the assistant public affairs officer in Conakry, Guinea, the assistant press officer at the U.S. mission to the European Union in Brussels, Belgium, the cultural affairs officer in both Sofia, Bulgaria, and Prague, Czech Republic, and as the public affairs officer in The Hague, the Netherlands. And Sherry has also informed me that she's worked at the State Department for 21 years so far. So congratulations to her. We are most fortunate to have Ms. Kennison Hall with us today, and after her presentation, there will be time for Q&A with all of us here. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium Sherry Kennison Hall.
Good morning. So thank you, Krishna. Esther, thank you as well, and to UChicago for the invitation today. So I was asked to speak a little bit about trying to help you in how you can make sense of the war in Ukraine when you're teaching. And I apologize because honestly, I can't make sense of it myself. When I look at the acts that we see of naked aggression and unthinkable violence, I think it's hard for any of us to make sense of that. So instead of trying to make sense of it, I think maybe we should take a different goal and a different approach. So I'd like to recommend the approach that we sort of use when we're developing public, messaging for our public diplomacy, which is looking at the context, the reactions, and prevention. So I feel like we should examine the context of the events. We should decide on what our reactions will be, and we should explore what actions we can take to prevent an event from happening again like this. It feels like a healthier approach in a way, rather than trying to make sense of violence. So I'll attempt to do that today. And I'm trying to, this here so I don't destroy your computer. So I'll attempt to do that today. And I hope to take you a bit beyond the headlines and give you a kind of a glimpse into the diplomatic work that's currently going on in the State Department. So first, let me tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do. You heard my bio. I'm an American diplomat. I'm a public diplomacy officer. I'm now a senior foreign service officer, and I've been doing this for 21 years in 5 different countries. And I love international relations, and my love for it started very early. I was a military kid and grew up on military bases. My stepfather was an instructor on the M1A1 Abrams tank, which is quite in the news these days. And I happened to be living in a small military base in West Germany in November of 1989. A week before my 13th birthday, the Berlin Wall came down, and the world as we Cold War kids knew it changed, almost overnight. 5 months earlier, we saw a single man stand in front of a line of tanks in Tiananmen Square. And those 2 moments really stand out to me as sort of the beginning of my love for trying to understand the broader world. I was young, but I think that a lot of people can look at things like that in their past and kind of pinpoint a moment when you were like, this is what I really am interested in looking at. In December of 2021, I started this job. So I direct press and public diplomacy for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. We have 49 countries and 75 missions, about 650 employees working at our embassies between our local staff and our American diplomats working in public relations or public diplomacy, as we call it. It was already a busy job and made even busier currently by Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th of 2022. So let me start by saying that this devastating war has stretched on far too long already. But I want to step back and briefly examine the context of the unprovoked war in Ukraine. It had become apparent through intelligence in the fall of 2021 that Putin was planning an invasion. The US government shared intelligence with NATO allies and partners, stepped it down so that it could be declassified and shared to try and stop the invasion, but also to try and prepare people for what was coming. Many didn't want to believe it could or would happen. I didn't want to imagine myself that we would see such naked aggression, but despite our best efforts, the Kremlin's unprovoked war is now nearing a year. This has been a year of wreaking death and destruction on a scale we've not seen in Europe since World War II. The evidence continues to mount as well that members of Russian forces have been contributing to atrocities, including war crimes throughout Ukraine. Evidence of rape, torture, families being forced apart, children being taken from their parents and sent to live in Russia, being indoctrinated to forget about their lives in Ukraine, the values it stood for. It's really beyond awful. That's what we're dealing with when we talk about the war. That's the context of it. So what do diplomats do when the bombs start falling and diplomacy has failed? How do we react? Well, in this case, we we started with imposing extensive sanctions along with a wide coalition of allies and partners. These measures are degrading the Kremlin's ability to carry out its imperial project. Just last week, the Department of State and Treasury took action against individuals and entities linked to the Kremlin-backed paramilitary group Wagner and its head, Yevgeny Prigozhin, including key infrastructures, associated front companies, its battlefield operations in Ukraine, producers of Russia's weapons, and those administering Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. These actions support our goal to degrade Moscow's capacity to wage war against Ukraine and to promote accountability for those responsible for Russia's war of aggression and associated abuses. And it places further pressure on Russia's defense sector. Our hope is that these sanctions will continue to impede the Kremlin's ability to arm its war machine, which has caused unconscionable death and destruction. As with so many other conflicts in the world, we can also, as diplomats, bear witness. We can document, we can continue to look for solutions. We seek ways to promote peace, even in incremental bits. In Ukraine, we stand with them not only figuratively, but also physically, as our mission is open again in Kyiv, led by Ambassador Bridget Brink. We make commitments to the people of Ukraine to work with them and assist them as they seek justice that they demand and deserve. We support the International Criminal Court, the UN Commission for Inquiry in Ukraine, invocations of the OSCE Moscow mechanisms, and other efforts to document and investigate these crimes that we're seeing. This war was and still is completely unnecessary. It's a result of one man's twisted vision. Vladimir Putin started this war and he has the power to stop it. Sadly, it doesn't seem he has any interest in meaningful diplomacy. He denies Ukraine's unique identity and culture. He seeks to erase its sovereign statehood and independence. For almost a year, the brave men and women in Ukraine have heroically fought against Russia's invading forces. Also, for the last year, the US has led an international effort to equip Ukraine's military with the weapons it needs to defend itself. The president signed additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act in December, which provides over $45 billion in emergency funds across multiple agencies to advance Ukraine's overall economic recovery, security, energy sector, and capacity to cope with the ongoing humanitarian crisis created by Russia's attacks. This builds on the almost $49 billion the US has provided since 2014. If we have the context, then I think we have to look now at the reaction. We must turn to what we can do differently, so we've looked at the context and then the reactions, sanctions, aid, bearing witness, documenting, but now we could have to look at what we can do differently to prevent this from happening again. Our aims now for Ukraine are simple. The U.S. will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes so that Ukraine can continue to defend itself and be in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table when the time comes. So let me be clear. Russia remains the sole obstacle to peace in Ukraine. Russia's savage attacks on Ukraine are the latest demonstrations that President Putin has no interest in meaningful diplomacy, that short of erasing Ukraine's independence, he'll try to force Ukraine into a frozen conflict, lock in his gains, rest and refit his forces, and then at some point try again. Russia and Russia alone can end this war today. Caving to Russia's aggression and accepting it as its brazen attacks to redraw borders and by force tears up our rule book that has made all of us more secure and would have repercussions not only in Europe, but around the world. If the war were to end today, our work won't be done. There's going to be years of reconstruction. We've already been working with the government of Ukraine directly to ensure accountability and oversight are implemented now and in the future. We continue to work with Ukraine to ensure that all assistance continues to be properly used and safeguarded as they defend their sovereign and territorial integrity. Ukraine's already made it very clear that they're serious about their desire for good governance and transparency, as is evident by President Zelensky's recent dismissal of corrupt officials. Diplomats from around the world continue to work alongside my colleagues to support Ukraine because it's the right and necessary thing to do. Russia's aggression must be stopped, or it will risk further aggressions in other countries. We also recognize the decision to begin discussions about ending the war can only be made by Ukraine when and if Russia demonstrates that it's prepared to negotiate in good faith. In the meantime, we want Ukraine to be equipped to defend itself. So we don't know when this war will end, but we do know that Ukraine will emerge victorious, and the United States will continue to stand united with Ukraine for as long as it takes. The focus of my work is Europe, but this war matters for the rest of the world as well. It matters because we're in an unprecedented era of global connectivity. Putin's efforts to weaponize winter is leaving millions in Ukraine without heat or light during the traditionally darkest and coldest months of the year. Were this not one of the warmest winters on record, this might lead to yet another wave of refugees entering Europe and beyond. We also see a wave of migration out of Russia itself, first at the start of the war, then in September when they announced the mobilization. These actions have repercussions as well. UNHCR's most recent numbers total somewhere around 8 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe alone, which is about 18% of their population. It's hard to say how many Russians have left, but we're seeing numbers around 700,000. There was just a report that noted that from the FSB that noted that 9.7 million trips were taken out of the country in the third quarter, which is almost double that between April and June. Now, we don't know all of those trips and why people left, could be normal travel, but just to see that number jump up so much in the winter months leaves you to question whether or not that 700,000 number could actually be accurate. AFP reported just recently that 100,000 IT techs from Russia, about 10% of their IT force, have left the country. If you think about the traditional background of IT techs, it's usually young men. We know why they're leaving. Most of them, when they are asked, and you can question them, who are in the stands or in the Balts or in other parts of Europe, have said they left because they fear mobilization. Add to that the injured, the dead, and it starts to paint a picture that not just Ukraine will be affected by this war. Russia itself will be affected, even if they aren't taking incoming fire. Countries accepting Ukrainian refugees and immigrating Russians are affected as well. Countries who rely on Ukraine and Russia for grain are affected by this war. 40% of the World Food Programme's grain traditionally comes from Ukraine. Ukraine supplies 16% of the world's corn, 40% of the world's sunflower oil. Egypt and Bangladesh both get a quarter of their grain from Ukraine traditionally, and Moldova gets 90%, according to the BBC in the most recent numbers. Department of State has been working with Department of Agriculture, USAID, and others to work on food security. This was a major issue during the last UN General Assembly in September. State officials also visited Egypt in October to meet with the government ministries as well as banking sector to ensure that they were all aware that there are clear sanctions exemptions for Russian food and fertilizers. It's often said that war is hell, but what we don't realize is that it isn't just hell for those directly in the line of fire. In our globally interconnected world, it's the worst kind of butterfly effect. It means that a man can invade Ukraine and then a family in Bangladesh starves. My work is to articulate our foreign policy as much as to help shape it. But before we can develop a strategy on how to share our policy, we have to understand our policy. We have to think about what the audiences, who are the audiences we want to move, what's it we want to accomplish, what's the best vehicle for doing that. We use all kinds of tools in the State Department, from speaker programs to exchanges, arts, traditional media, social media, interviews, conferences, etc. Before the war, we started talking about building unity with partners and allies so that they better understood the risks of the impending disaster. We worked with local audiences in Europe to try and make sure they understood that there was an impending refugee crisis coming. We followed that work with countering disinfo about the war that we still see today, and making sure that people understood why they were being targeted. Currently, we're working on plans to mark the 1 year, we don't say anniversary, it's a little bit too celebratory, but the 1 year mark of the full-scale invasion. We continue to work with Ukrainian partners too, in civil society, reconstruction, good governance, etc. We're also looking to reach Russian audiences that we still, to let them know we still seek a relationship with them. In Moscow, our embassy carries out virtual and in-person events for Russians eager to engage with the West. Embassy Moscow still continues to foster relationships, conduct interviews with Russian press. Our missions in Latvia, Belgium, and DC, and even in DC at the department, we host a steady stream of Russian independent media, thought leaders, just as we look to tell the real story and gain insights from them who have fled Russia's oppression and increasingly restrictive foreign agent and propaganda laws. In my office, we have what we call the Rapid Response Unit that we set up right before the start of the war, where currently we're working to try and reach Russian people in original Russian language with content that we develop, often drawing from existing state or transcripts from Putin, Russian leaders, and members of the Russian military, and everyday citizens to highlight contradictions and disinformation found in official Kremlin communications. The unit worked in tandem with our Global Public Affairs Office in the Department of State to produce recently something called Message to the Russian People. It was a video that was released last month. And that video linked key moments in the US-Russia cultural and scientific achievements and relationship, and it juxtaposed it against visuals of the war in Ukraine and protests by Russian citizens. The engagement on that was off the charts. It was like nothing we'd ever seen. And the commentary from Russians was really quite promising, because it was really, I think they saw, like, we really want to connect and continue a relationship with the Russian people. So to close, how do you make sense of war? I still can't answer that. But I think if you equip your students with the context, if you ask them to consider what actions they would take, and ask them to consider what they could be doing to prevent actions in the future, it's not only a way to help them understand, but it's a way to help them work through a process in the future that will give them better tools to be able to tackle other such concepts, even if it's from school shootings in our own country to, racial divide and oppression. I applaud you for hosting today's conference, and I look forward to your questions, and thank you for listening.
So for questions, please raise your hand and I'll run the mic to you.
Earlier on in the year, we were hearing about the Poles planning to send, excuse me, if you could slide that whole thing down, because the thing of blocking your face is kind of distracting, and tip it up, that would be nicer. Thank you. The Poles were going to send their MiG jets, and now we've got the tanks going in. I'm just curious what the situation, because I haven't heard about the Poles sending their MiGs, but the Germans are saying they're not going to send jets. So what's the status of fighters going into, or jets going into Ukraine at the moment, as well as you know it?
I'm gonna have to pull my talking points now. So I think of late we were focused on obviously the tanks. I know that the president has said no to F-16s. Recently, I'm unsure of where we are with the MiGs and the Poles. I think that's up to the Poles. But our line has been that it's really up to each country to decide what they want to send. I think, some countries have said that, well, we don't feel like there's certain equipment they don't want to send because they're afraid it would take too long to train. It isn't something they need right now. So I think I'd have to, I'm not an expert on what the polls are doing with that, but I do know that there has been conversations within NATO itself. If a country sends something, are they going to be able to backfill that? How much can they send and still have enough to protect themselves in their country were it to come to that? But I think it's also a matter of looking at, if I were Ukrainian, I'd want everything all at once right now, right? So I think it's a matter of looking at how quickly those stocks can be replenished on the other end. If you're a country you have to think about your security as well. But I'm not 100% sure on where the polls are with their MiGs. I do know that there were some transfers recently of helicopters, and I think that's, that aerial support is being considered by a lot of countries.
Can you speak a little bit more about the embassy in Moscow and what it's like for the people working at that embassy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we talked to our embassy in Moscow. We have a small public affairs unit there. It's an incredibly small platform now, because we used to have a very robust embassy with locally engaged staff, what we call LE, locally LE staff. However, a few years ago, we were informed that we could no longer employ Russians at the embassy. So the small but mighty American staff there does everything from scrub toilets to mow the lawn to shovel snow. It's a very interesting environment to work in. Recently, you may have seen that our new ambassador arrived. When she went to present her credentials, there were protesters at the MFA. They were, if you can watch, allowed to get incredibly close to her vehicle. We recently had an event in person. It's been COVID, so we haven't had a lot of in-person events at any of our embassies, but we're starting to, reopen those events. But we recently had an event that they hosted with alumni of our exchange programs. And they were able to get about 24 Russians who came to the embassy to this event, which is fantastic. But they were met with what we assume to be paid protesters out front. We had run a competition recently for, peace posters, and those were able to be posted outside the embassy walls, so they could be seen by the public as well. But they do have large, not everything we do is political engagement. We do a lot of engagements, especially in public diplomacy on the cultural and educational side. So we have a lot of engagements with teachers, English teachers in particular, who are looking for tools that they can use in the classroom, techniques. So we have a huge amount of engagement in that fashion. We still have Russian students and scholars who come to the United States either on as international students or on Fulbrights. We have a large number of programs that are still ongoing. Even though, I will say that, again, you can't really look at what was before, because COVID has really affected that everywhere. So we can't kind of look at the numbers, but what we do sense is that particularly on the people to people level, there are a lot of Russians who want to engage with the US. Not on a political level, but rather on a people to people, whether it's about the arts or about space. NASA still works with Russia on this. So we do see a lot of engagement on that side. It is difficult, but it still exists. Outside of Russia, we have a lot of engagement with independent media who've left. I myself have met with people from TV Dost and Meduza. We meet with people who have worked with NGOs. You may have seen last week, I think it was last week or the week before, that both Meduza and the Helsinki group were basically closed down, or labeled undesirable. So, it's very concerning to us that you see the Helsinki group was the longest and, human rights group to exist in Russia, and now is no more, is not allowed to exist anymore. So it's incredibly concerning to us what we see there. And the stories that we hear. I met with Russians, independent media in Riga in June, and it's there was even a long-term American who worked for Moscow Times who left, and she said, you know, she'd never thought that she would leave. She just never thought it would be that the situation would get to that level.
Awesome. Hi. One of the questions that kind of comes up in one of the classes that I teach. So I teach high school, and you know, some of our students, it's a contemporary history class, and a lot of the work that we do is just trying to get them interested in it, you know, within current events. And some of the questions they have are, you know, simple questions, but I think it's a good place to start. And at the beginning, when we talk about what's happening in, you know, in the conflict in the Ukraine, one question that they have is, well, wait a minute. So, you know, Russia is this. They look at the map and they see Russia as giant country, and the Ukraine is, you know, smaller country, and they ask the question, okay, well, why didn't we just go and help the Ukraine at first? Why didn't we just give them everything they needed at first, and in order to get Russia to stop, you know, invading them? And obviously, there's so many complexities, there's so many layers to that. You know, for them, like, they kind of see it as, okay, well, just give them every single thing, give the Ukrainians every single thing they could have needed at first, and you know, that could have been it. And it's like, well, guys, it's much more complicated than that. So I think in trying to at least introduce the topic to them, what could be a way that when you have, say, like high school sophomores, you can kind of begin the conversation of just like, yes, like we kind of saw this was happening, but this is why you just can't go in and just give every single like form of like military supply and technology, and we just couldn't give them everything they needed, because it could have, there could have been other consequences as well. And then the second part is, one thing they're very interested in is just kind of how life is, and you know, in some of the cities, especially like in Kyiv, you know, for kids their age, like just kind of just going about their daily routine. What are some things you've seen or heard just about, you know, just, I mean, daily life in general? I mean, aside from what we see in the news every day.
So, yeah, I mean, it's a valid question, right? And it kind of goes back to, you know, what about air cover? Why don't we just give them everything? And I'm not going to have a good answer for you. You know, my job is to talk about foreign policy, so I have my own opinions. But again, I think, you know, it comes down to not wanting to escalate. You know, this isn't a proxy war between the US and Russia, as much as Russia would like to label it like that. But let's back up for a moment and go back to the invasion, because, you know, we say full scale invasion happened February 24th, but the invasion happened in March of 2014. Like, you know, that's when the invasion happened. In Crimea and the Donbass, there has been fighting going on in that region ever since. We, at that time, really, US and let's say NATO really also stepped up capacity building. And I think you see the results of that today in how well the Ukrainians could defend themselves. You know, if you go back to news reporting from January of last year, I remember watching a report showing Ukrainians digging trenches and basically saying like, well, if Russia invades, like they're done for. Like they just, you know, this ragtag army, how are they going to defend themselves? I think it's a testament to NATO training and capacity. You know, I can't speak for certain as to why Finland and Sweden made the decisions they did to try and join NATO, but I can say that it's, if you want to see what NATO can do when you're trained well, like look no further than the Ukrainian military. I think there's, you know, growing up in the military, there's something called force discipline, right? And it's like, you train, it's sort of like if you're a marathoner, it's like train the way you want to run your race, right? You train, you take care of your equipment, you rotate out equipment that is old or getting old. You make sure you rotate your tires. And at the beginning of the war, if you look at the state of the equipment that we saw from the Russian military, if you look at the blown out tires on their trucks, the expired MREs, the meals ready to eat, the lack of equipment now for mobilized troops, like you do realize like just from a force, you know, discipline perspective, there seems to be an issue there. Whereas you don't see that, like the Ukrainian military is winterized. Like, you know, nobody wants to be fighting in sub-zero temperatures, but they have winterized gear, you know, and you see a much less well-equipped Russian military. So I mean, that's sort of yeah, I don't have a great answer other than like geopolitically, I think it probably wouldn't have been best for NATO to fight that fight for the Ukrainians. To the second part of your question, life in Kyiv. So our embassy, we evacuated our diplomats on ordered departure, I think at the end of January, if I'm not incorrect, of last year. The public affairs section came and camped in my office. So they were there with us for a number of months. They reopened the embassy. Ambassador Brink went, they raised the flag. They have been there ever since. I get messages constantly from our public affairs officer, who's a very good friend. You know, the most recent one was at 1 a.m. his time, and it was like, it's 1 a.m. I'm back in the bunker. It's, it's real. And it was interesting when I was in the Netherlands, we were trying to, you have a whole new generation of even younger millennials and Gen Zers who don't remember World War II. Their grandparents are too young. It's like people like my grandparents who remember World War II, right? So the next generation, it's a distant memory. And in fact, I'll point you at something that occurred to me when Notre Dame burned in Paris. The outpouring of emotion from people struck me because I'd been planning anniversary events for the Marshall Plan in the Netherlands. And it struck me that the younger generations in Europe have not seen destruction. Go back and look at pictures from World War II of European towns. Rotterdam was leveled, Paris, London, places where people walked amongst the rubble, like slept in bunkers, had blackout curtains, and yet went about their day, right? Like that. We've had 70 years of unprecedented peace in Europe because we have these institutions, because of the Marshall Plan, because of NATO, because of the European Union, the strength of this multilateral diplomacy. But those younger generations, like war is something distant, destruction is something distant. I mean, they raised like $1 billion for Notre Dame in like 24 hours. Now, flash forward to people that are living in Kyiv, kids going to school and, knowing the drill, like, okay, we're going to do the lesson in the basement because we're under, a threat. Like, we're resilient. When you think back about probably your grandparents' generation or even beyond great grandparents, when they talk about the Depression and World War I, World War II and things like that, like people can be very resilient. We can do what we need to do to survive. But yeah, the people of Ukraine really are suffering something that I think, and it impacts, I have a 16-year-old, it impacts kids that age because that's something they read about and they saw black and white footage of, and now it's in full color. They can communicate, like our kids are interconnected in a way, like between TikTok and Twitch streams and, gaming. They game with kids around the world. They talk to these kids. They know what's going on. I saw somebody recently on Twitter say, how come there's no footage of the war in Ukraine? I thought, where are you looking? Because I see it all the time. It's and part of that also, in 2014, it wasn't just let's equip the Ukrainians with being able to defend themselves. We also made a large push, between the US and Europe to promote civic engagement, citizen journalism, to build up capacity for NGOs. And it's something beautiful. I mean, you hope that it never has to happen, but did happen with like our American spaces. We have American spaces across Europe and across the world really, but across Ukraine, we have these things called either America Houses or American Spaces. The librarians and, coordinators of these spaces overnight turned and because they already were connected to those communities in Ukraine, overnight, those spaces turned into shelters. They turned into schoolrooms. They turned into community centers for information. I was told recently by some Ukrainians who said like they've gone back to like printing like newsletters or broadsheet type papers to like inform, because a lot of the people in some of the areas, like especially occupied areas, are elderly who couldn't leave, and so that to inform them about what's going on, like that kind of civic engagement, it's just inspiring. I know the woman who runs our American Spaces in Ukraine. She was in my office when she was ordered departure. She's now sitting in Vienna, and like they were able to recently reopen America House Lviv. And it was just incredibly touching and incredibly like, but it's important too, because it's like as much as you're living amongst the sirens and the possible destruction, you also have to have something to look forward to and hope for the future, right? So, and I would encourage you, like, go look at the embassy's Facebook, go look at the embassy's, Twitter and their Instagram and the things that you see them doing, because it really is inspiring, because what they're really trying to do is like stand with people like physically and say, like, we're here having conversations. Someone said once, there was a picture of Ambassador Brink meeting with some Ukrainians in Kyiv in a garden, and someone said, yeah, but is this an image you really want of like, she's sitting in a garden with Ukrainians? And like her response was like, yes, because this is life right now. Like we can have a moment to sit amongst, the flowers and talk, but like they know they're living in a war zone. They understand better than we do. So yes, there was no sort of controversy in those optics, because she's like, I want people to know it's not just me trying to stand here as like, oh, I'm a wartime ambassador. It's me connecting with the people as I'm supposed to be doing, whether we were in war or not. So just the utmost respect for Ambassador Brink. She's really amazing. Their whole team is incredible.
I have two questions. First is, there's sort of a cottage industry in the US among thought leaders like John Mearsheimer here, sort of narrating the run up to the war and talking about how it was Western miscalculations and provocations with NATO expansion that somehow led to this. And I'm wondering how you think we should talk about that with students or children. So I'm talking to my kids, and that's my second question, which is, as a child of the 80s, I grew up terrified of nuclear war. How should I speak to my kids about the nuclear question that Putin keeps raising?
So don't forget.
So
Nukes.
NATO run up with Mearsheimer types and the nuclear question. Yeah.
So I would say there was a lot of disinformation before the war that was being spread. Some of it was, just people hypothesizing. Some of it was actively being spread about, the role of NATO or about, threats. We saw a lot of disinformation. We still do, coming out of Russia about, the genocide on Russian people in occupied territories and so on. I will say that at the start, before the war started, and I'm alluded to this in my speech, but I can give you, direct, like how we were looking at this. And all of this has been declassified. So the US government had the intel that Russia looked like they were building up forces for an invasion. At first, there were a lot of people who didn't want to believe that, right? There were a lot of people who were like, yes, we see the intel, but how do we sell this to our populations? Like, how do we say to like general population, hey, we got to do something? At an unprecedented speed that I've ever seen in my career, there was intel declassified to share with people. And I feel like that was a tool that we never really utilized before. That was smart for us to utilize, because we live in an era where there is a lot of active disinformation, propaganda. I mean, there always has been, right? But now it can spread so easily. There's actually a great website for our Global Engagement Center. The GEC runs Disarming Disinfo. You can access it through the State Department's website. And they look at different disinfo campaigns and try to really do the research of digging down and showing you, this newspaper in, or digital newspaper in this state literally comes from RT. And RT feeds them things, and then they publish it. And then back in Russia, they quote this paper to show that, oh, it's not RT, it's this paper in, Cedar Rapids or wherever. It's all on Disarming Disinfo. You can see this stuff. So I feel like some of that is there. I feel like it's also important for us to contextualize it for the American citizens like we did, and for others, for our partners and allies, so that they understood. I mean, I spent 3 years in the Netherlands working to promote the Dutch increasing their NATO contributions to the 2% they agreed to in 2014 at the Wales commitments. I spent 3 years working on that, and we weren't really moving the needle. And now the Dutch have committed to their 2% because I think, like, it's obvious why you need NATO, right? It's obvious why we need to have strong security and defense alliances. The second part of your question about the nuclear question, that's a tough one, right? I mean, we all grew up with sort of like, I mean, look at the fiction and the films and stuff that we grew up with in the 80s. And even before that. The way I talk about it, because I do have teenagers, is that they exist, right? Nuclear weapons exist. So there's not really a lot that we can do to make them not exist. So we should acknowledge that they're there, but we should continue to try diplomacy and just hope that mutual assured destruction is still a real thing, that people, it's sort of like, yes, it's there, but it means that we have to kind of almost reach that stalemate with nuclear weapons and just say, well, if one side wants to use them, the other side's going to as well. It's not an easy thing to talk about, it wasn't an easy thing to live through the first time. So now having children, I look at it from a very different perspective than just, at least our kids know that your school desk isn't going to help you. But I don't know, I'm not going to quote a Sting song, but you kind of just hope that people love their kids too, and no desire to escalate to that level. But it is a tough one. I wish I had more answers for you on that, but.
Are we sure of Putin's ultimate goals? Are they clearly defined of how much he wants, how far he wants to go?
I don't think so. I think it's hard. That's a hard nut to crack. Like, what are the ultimate goals? What's the end game here? We can go with what we hear, what we see. Like right now, I think they announced that they would like to have a Russian military that's 1.5 million. That was announced recently, which is huge. I think somebody did the math and said that would mean that 1 in every 25 Russian males between the ages of 18 and 59 would be in the military. I'm not sure if that's what the Russian people themselves envision for their future. But no, I don't think we can, I think you could go to 100 experts who have studied, have PhDs on Putin and Russia, and they would give you 100 different answers about what they think the end game and the end goals are. So, we do the best we can. And I think it's good that we still do have an embassy. I think, for me, diplomacy is always the way. It's always worth trying. And, even when doors are shut, we hopefully never shut them ourselves, So this is why we still believe our exchange programs with Russians are important. There are some who would like us not to have exchange programs with Russians, or would like Russians not to be able to compete in the Olympics and so on. But, I think we try to be very clear that it's not the Russian people. This is a war, a Kremlin war. This is Putin's war. Because, we have had a long-standing relationship with the people of Russia, and we want to continue that. But as for, I'm not going to try and predict or read Putin's mind. Again, I think the best you can do is try to figure out what our own goals are and define those. And again, like, our goal is to put Ukraine in the very best position and the strongest position they can be in when the time comes and they decide they want to negotiate.
Outline the peace process, because you've talked about peace negotiation. And I know there was talk last year that Boris Yeltsin told Zelensky to back off on negotiating on peace. So can you outline what we've done or how the peace negotiation has been going in the last year, or even back to 2014?
Again, like that, our thing, what we say is it is for Ukraine to decide when they want to come to the table and what their negotiation strategy will be. So right now, our strategy has been to equip Ukraine with assistance, with military aid so that they can defend themselves, with aid for the humanitarian crisis, whether it's the taking down of the electrical grid, which in the heating grid, trying to like weaponize winter. But it's really, again, it's like, we're not part of that. We're not pushing Ukraine to do one thing or another. That's up to them to really decide when and if they want to negotiate. So that's, that is how you can go back and look at speeches of, I think last week we actually had our Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Toria Newland, did a hearing in Washington. We recently had Secretary Blinken was here in Chicago like a week or two ago and did a speech before, I think it was the Chicago Foreign Affairs Council, something like that. Oh, and here, okay. And so you can, like, their speeches are better than I can offer you. I have a small part of, like, I'm not involved in those things. I'm involved in our public messaging and our public diplomacy. But again, I think, our goal is to make sure that the Ukrainians have what they need to put them in the strongest position when and if they want to negotiate.
Oh, I think approximately 4 to 6 weeks before the war started, the U.S. seemed to be pretty certain that the war was going to happen. And yet it seemed that the Ukraine did not believe this. And if I remember correctly, most of Europe didn't seem to believe this. You said they were declassifying documents. I'm just curious, like, why was the U.S. so certain? And yet the other people did not seem to follow that. And then some of the interviews I've seen of State Department people were so certain, and yet it didn't seem like we sent items like in January that would have helped to slow down or help reverse the invasion. So I'm just curious if you could talk about that period right before the war and what the U.S. was thinking and why the rest of the world didn't seem to believe it.
So I touched on that a little bit by saying, that's what I meant by saying, like, we were working to declassify information. I'll give you an example. So there was a Department of State news, a press conference or, daily press brief with our spokesperson, Ned Price, where he talked about this idea that there was going to be some kind of, this is before the invasion, some kind of Russian false flag video or event that was going to make it look like Ukrainians had attacked Russians. He did not present, he presented it at the podium with a statement, and he was immediately challenged by the press corps of, well, where's your proof? Like, we've seen this before with the US government, like, you have to show us now, you can't just tell us. And so it was pretty evident that, like, that's what we had to do was, like, because in fact, there was an article that was written by about, I think it was in the Washington Post, about INR, which is our intelligence and research division of the State Department, and how their very small intel, community got it right on 2 different events in the last couple of years when others got it wrong. And it was Afghanistan and it was Ukraine. And I think it was really, most people didn't want to believe that the Russians would actually do that. Like that, but what we saw from intelligence that now has been declassified, and part of it was declassified because of this exactly, was to be able to say, like, because you're right, like, even if you go back and look at news reports, even in Ukraine, they didn't want to believe that there was going to be an invasion. But it was like, no, we see the massing of the troops. We see that this is going to happen. Like, I honestly think we delayed the invasion by about 2 weeks by a series of events that took place with our secretary and others who were going out and at like record speed, declassifying info and giving it about this false flag. The Russians are going to claim that there was this instigating act, and that's why they have to invade. The Russians are going to claim this. We kind of coined the phrase like pre-bunking, like where we're not debunking, but we're taking things that we see that we think is going to happen, and then we're putting it out there ahead of time to say like this is going to happen. And we've seen that with, there was going to be a claim that we saw that the Ukrainians were going to use chemical weapons or something like that. And we had the then White House spokesperson, Jim Psaki, go out in the press brief and like, I worked that issue like all day. We were like, we need somebody to go to the podium and say, the Russians are going to claim that the Ukrainians are using chemical weapons. Please claim this. Or that the Ukrainians will use chemical, something like, please go out and say this is going to happen, because if we say they're going to do this, then maybe it stops them from doing it. And it did, like, because she went out to the podium and said, hey, you're going to hear they're going to claim this. The next day, Lavrov was in Turkey and he came out and said, oh, the Ukrainians are going to use chemical weapons. And everybody's like, oh yeah, the White House said you were going to say that. Like, so it kind of took the wind out of the sails there. But it's so incredibly important to, obviously like intelligence, exists, classified intelligence for a reason. But like, we've made the argument that in this day and age, like there are some things that is better shared amongst the populations, because I mean, honestly, like the Europeans, I don't think were convinced, the Ukrainians themselves weren't convinced. I'm not sure what we could have done to stop the invasion once it was decided. Honestly, we could write papers on that, right? Or what we could have done to better equip the Ukrainians right off the bat. I'm sure we can sort of Monday morning quarterback that for years, but I think that I do have to say what we did, I know, in pushing this message out and getting the unity amongst our partners and allies, particularly in NATO. I honestly think we delayed the war by probably as much as 2 weeks, which gave people enough time, because by that time, the Ukrainians also believed it, to start moving people out, especially women and children. We also were like prepping our embassies, like this is coming, all of our bordering embassies, like, okay, like, what do we do? Because, of course, our embassies work with not just like, communities, but the Americans, and there are tons of dual citizens, tons of Americans in Ukraine. And it was like, you're not going to be able to get out, through the airport. You're going to need to go over land. I remember even thinking in December when I was talking to one of our smaller embassies that borders, and they were saying, well, we really only have a land crossing. We have like one road. And I remember thinking, if we get to the point where people are crossing into this country on foot, like that, it's gotten really bad. And then we got there in no time. And so even I, like, being able to know and see everything was still, I mean, I have to say, a little bit shocked. And I think part of that is just, I like to think that, like, as I think we all like to think we're post history, and then we all realize we're in history, right? We're living it all the time. So, it is, everything old is new again. So it's difficult. And I think there were a lot of people who just didn't want to believe that either, that, because honestly, has this been economically beneficial for Russia? Has it been beneficial for the Russian people? Like, I mean, is it a decision you would make that if you were calculating, okay, let's see, is this going to enrich my country? Is this going to make things better? I'm really not sure that would be a calculation that you would make sort of with all the information that you have, so then obviously other things are at play when making that calculation. But again, I'm not going to speculate on those motives. I wouldn't dare try to get in the brain of Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. I have a question in regard of the environment. Is the US supporting in any aspect of the restoration of Ukraine field and agricultural sector?
Which sector?
Agricultural. So the
Oh, okay.
environment, how
Yeah.
is dealing with the destruction?
It's rough because as I talked about, the food security issue is real. You know, Ukraine and Russia both are bread baskets, right? They both produce a large amount of the world's grain, large amount of sunflower oil, large amounts of, you know, those two countries help to feed a lot of people in the world. So like, you know, that even has ramifications here in Chicago, right? With your price of bread, with your price of gas right now. I mean, all of this sort of, we are in, whether people understand it or not, you know, we are a globally interconnected world. So the US, we've done a lot of assistance through AID and like agriculture and stuff of like new equipment to help like farmers plow their fields. There was a lot of destroyed equipment. We're like, it's hard because I forget the exact number, but it's like, it's over 20% of Ukraine is mined currently. The Russians have mined it, which makes it incredibly hard to, you know, we're going to have to demine for years, like to take out landmines. And so, you know, I mean, how do you farm in the middle of a war zone? We did see, you know, there have been negotiations to allow grain ships to leave ports. Turkey had helped with those negotiations between the US and or between Russia and Ukraine. That has allowed a number of grain ships to leave that then went to like Egypt, went to Africa and other places. So that's good, at least, like, because there was already grain from last year that had been harvested that was in ships that were stuck in port. There's been, unfortunately, a lot of also mining, you know, the technical term, I can't remember, but like, you know, we have landmines and then we have mines that are water mines, right? I don't know the technical term. But in the Black Sea, there's a lot of mines. And so that also has been a real problem because, you know, you don't want one of these ships hit by one of these mines. You know, Port of Odessa has been difficult trying to get ships out of the Port of Odessa. We've had, you know, farming equipment and stuff that we can see be targeted by Russian forces, just like this, the electrical grid has been targeted. So, you know, the US continues to do, whether it's through negotiating with, you know, sort of third parties, through sending aid, through sending equipment, things like that, whether it's generators or tractors, like there's been a lot of that that has gone to Ukraine. You know, I think it's going to be a while before we see normalization, even if the war were to end tomorrow, like to get back up to where they were. So I know there was also, like I said, there were sanctions exemptions for things like Russian grain, Russian fertilizer, other, you know, countries produce fertilizer that's incredibly important to African countries or other parts of the world. So you want to make sure that that can still get to those places that can grow with that fertilizer. So there's also been, you know, talks about, we have an entire division in the State Department works on food security, but I would encourage like going back and looking at the UN General Assembly. You know, back in September, there was a ton of conversations on this, on food security and making sure that, you know, the ramifications of the war are minimized on the global level, because we definitely don't want people starving in other countries because the grain in Ukraine and Russia can't get out because of that.
I have a question. How did the American policy has changed since the first aggression when they took Crimea and some other republic? I think they also took some other land. And at that time, as I remember, the Ukrainians were not really fighting. There was no war. They were just kind of giving up. So their attitude has changed since the first aggression, and that's tremendous change, because I was just surprised that they would just give up. You know, I think it was 2014 the first time. So, and United States didn't do anything that more than condemn it. And now it's totally different approach. So how did the foreign policy evolve?
I mean, it's an excellent question. One, there's been continued fighting in those regions. If you were from Donbass or Crimea, you would know that like it's been basically a conflict since 2014. That while there, in particular in Crimea, we've seen there were a lot of Russian citizens imported into those regions to like live so that then they could like say, hey, these are Russians and they want to be part of Russia. But what's interesting is the public opinion has changed in those, before the start of the war, there was a large number, and I'm not going to remember the right numbers, but a percentage of people who would have said, like, leave Crimea and Donbass, like, we'll, if we could have peace with Russia, like, we'll give them Crimea and Donbass. And then now even citizens who were dual citizens or Russian-speaking Ukrainians who would have sided at that point have changed their mind. And it's like 78% of people living in those regions are now saying, no, like, this is Ukraine, like, we want to be Ukraine. US foreign policy on that, yeah, I think it definitely has, policy evolves, we change, right? But I think it was something where, okay, if Ukraine they have to drive this car, so this is their country. Yes, there was this invasion. There seems to be, we don't like it, but there seems to be a stalemate here. But the further invasion really just precipitated that, no, this requires a much more, I think, global approach, like to support Ukraine and to show that we really actually stand behind. You can't just take territories by force. But foreign policy, we can always evolve. I think there were a lot of critics who said in 2014, maybe the global reaction should have been stronger. I was in the Czech Republic and the Czechs didn't mince words about it at the time. I mean, they were like, yeah, we've seen this before, with the Sudetenland. Don't worry, they'll come back for more. Like, so, I mean, there was a lot of criticism. I mean, I think there's still a lot of criticism to be had about maybe there should have been more done in 2014. But again, Monday morning quarterbacking, right? We don't always get it right. But I will say that sort of period between 2014 and the invasion in 2022 of trainings, not just military, but of civic education, of pushing support, like for, the Ukrainians. I feel like it had an impact, not just how Ukrainians see themselves as part of where they sit in the global structure. I mean, I think they feel like they're very European. It pushed them westward. And, who knows at what point, that the conflict, if it had just been in Donbass and Crimea, like, who knows where we'd be today if there was no further invasion, if there was no full-scale invasion. But I don't know. It's tough living through history because, we don't get to skip and read the end of the book. We have to like go through it. So we'll see. But yeah, I do think there's plenty of people who have a lot of criticism about the global reaction, the European, the US reaction in 2014 to foreign policy and maybe where we should have stood with Ukraine more so. We can but learn,
So unfortunately, we are all out of time, though I encourage you to continue the conversation throughout our activities today. Please, everybody, can we just thank Sherry for a wonderful keynote speech?
Thank you for your questions.